What does it mean to be denied dignity even in death? In 2009, Madieye Diallo, a young gay man in Senegal, died in silence. But what followed was a public act of brutality that still echoes today, a body exhumed, not once, but twice, left at his parents' doorstep as a warning. This isn't just a story about homophobia. It's a story about media complicity, community violence, and how silence can become its own form of cruelty. Madieye Diallo was born in Senegal and later migrated to Mali in search of work and community. There, he lived more openly as a gay man and eventually contracted HIV. In early 2009, following a wave of anti-LGBTQ+ crackdowns in Mali, including the arrest of at least 9 men in a nightclub raid, Mali's government began deporting LGBTQ+ individuals back to their home countries. To understand Diallo's death, we have to go back to 2008, when a local Senegalese tabloid icon published photographs from a supposed private gay wedding in Dakar. The backlash was immediate. Police began rounding up men suspected of being homosexual. People were beaten. Others were forced to expose names. One of those named was Madieye Diallo. In Senegal, homosexuality is criminalized. But this public outing didn't just bring stigma. It invited violence, both from the state and society. What followed his death would become a national scandal and a turning point in the public persecution of queer people in Senegal. On the same day he died, his family arranged for his burial at the Thiaroye cemetery. However, hours after his burial, news of his death and sexual orientation spread rapidly. Local imams and neighborhood residents gathered at the cemetery in protest. They claimed that Diallo's presence defiled sacred ground and accused him of contaminating the cemetery with impurity. Religious leaders declared that unless his body was exhumed and removed, no other person could be buried there. They insisted that his grave had desecrated the space and publicly demanded its cleansing. By evening, a crowd had gathered. Under pressure from community members, religious authorities, and with no intervention from the police, Diallo's grave was exhumed. His corpse was dragged from the ground, wrapped in plastic, and placed on the side of the road near a bridge. The act was not only public but performative, designed to send a message. Witnesses later described how people spat on the body, called him names, and refused to allow his remains to rest. The body was left exposed through the night. Eventually, members of his family, fearing further violence, relocated his remains and buried him in an undisclosed location. No public accountability followed. No religious leader or community member was investigated for the desecration. The media's role during and after this incident reflected a pattern of complicity. Many newspapers and radio stations reported the incident with sensational headlines, reproducing the language of shame and pollution, echoing the justifications used by the crowd. Madieye Diallo's desecration was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of posthumous violence against queer men in Senegal between 2008 and 2010. In 2008, Serigne Mbaye, another gay man, died and was denied burial in the Muslim cemetery of Rufisque. The imam refused to perform funeral rites after learning of his sexual orientation. In 2010, Cheikh, a tailor from Dakar, was buried at the Yoff cemetery. Shortly afterward, his grave was desecrated by local residents who discovered that he had been accused of homosexuality. His body was dug up, and the remains were discarded near a dump. Similarly, Mbaye's body was exhumed in Thiaroye for the same reason. Across these cases, queer men were symbolically lynched in death, stripped of dignity, erased from sacred space, and rendered unworthy of mourning. What made these acts particularly brutal was not just the physical desecration but the institutional and societal silence that followed. The Senegalese government, while aware of these incidents, failed to publicly condemn them. Law enforcement did not intervene, and in some cases, may have facilitated the exhumations by refusing to protect the gravesites. Religious leaders actively incited these acts, using Friday sermons to rally communities against the pollution of cemeteries. The media, far from serving as a watchdog, often amplified anti-LGBTQ+ sentiments. Outlets like L'Observateur and Le Soleil published articles that framed the desecrations as justified religious acts. Journalists used homophobic slurs and moral panic language, presenting these events not as violations of human rights but as community purification rituals. Rather than challenging the desecrations, media narratives normalized them, casting queer men as contaminating figures who deserved to be expelled even in death. These actions echoed deeper historical patterns of social exclusion, invoking ideas of ritual purity and pollution rooted in both Islamic and traditional cosmologies. In this context, queerness was treated not merely as a private identity but as a contagious impurity threatening the moral order. This framework allowed for the justification of extreme violence, not just physical, but symbolic, spiritual, and communal. The public nature of these desecrations turned them into spectacles, ritualized forms of expulsion meant to reinforce heteronormative boundaries and assert religious authority. Bodies were transformed into objects through which moral panic was enacted. The exhumed became warnings. Their deaths were mobilized as moral lessons. The idea that the queer body could defile not just individual purity but entire spaces, cemeteries, neighborhoods, and nations, became central to the logic of posthumous violence. The desecration of queer graves also reveals how death does not offer reprieve from violence for marginalized people. Instead, it becomes an extension of their social exile. In denying burial rights, communities denied queer individuals the right to citizenship, belonging, and memory. These acts erased not just lives but histories. Despite this violence, resistance persisted quietly. Families who still buried their loved ones in secret, queer networks that documented these abuses despite state indifference, and international activists who began to speak out, all became part of a silent archive of protest. Yet, within Senegal, to this day, the desecration of queer graves remains largely unacknowledged, unaddressed, and unspoken. In Diallo's case, it was particularly worrying that after being exhumed and dragged from his grave, was not only spat on and dumped in front of his parents' home, it was also filmed during the desecration. The footage, captured on mobile phones, was later burned onto CDs and sold in marketplaces across Dakar. These recordings turned his posthumous lynching into a commodity, spreading his humiliation as a form of public spectacle and reinforcing the message that queer bodies could be violated with impunity, even in death. The dissemination of this footage exacerbated the community's sense of vulnerability. One of Diallo's friends, also living with HIV, expressed deep fear for his own posthumous treatment, questioning whether his family would be able to bury him without similar desecration. This incident underscored the pervasive homophobia in Senegal, where even in death, LGBTQ+ individuals face discrimination and violence. Madieye Diallo is not just a symbol of what went wrong. He was a son, a friend, and a human being. His life and death force us to confront a harsh truth, that violence doesn't always end at death. Sometimes, it extends into the silence, the media, and even politics. Together, these forces can erase a person completely. Diallo's story, though tragic, is not one we should forget. It is a reminder of the power of erasure, and the necessity of remembrance. We tell these stories not to shock, but to honor. Because even lost histories like Madiye's carry the power to shape our future. If this story moved you, don't let it fade away. Share it. Speak about it. Ask questions. Let us not remain silent, for it is in remembering that we keep the fight for justice alive. Thank you for watching. In our next video, we learn about the history of queens who ran matriarchal systems. So before you go, do not forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss another video on lost history.